Every Sunday after church, there was a place your family went. No one called it tradition, you just went, the same way you always sat in the same corner booth without anyone saying which one was yours. The plates were heavy, the food was right. You knew the woman behind the counter by name, and she knew yours. These are 15 beloved restaurants, scattered across the country, that quietly disappeared from everyday life. Section 1. Pascal's Restaurant. Nobody labeled the booth in the back left corner. Nothing roped it off. No sign, no velvet rope, no hostess who pointed you somewhere else. You just understood, the way you understood which pew belonged to certain families at church and which seat at the dinner table belonged to your grandfather. If you ate at Pascal's in Atlanta long enough, you understood that corner was where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sat when he needed to think. And the room gave it to him without being asked. That was simply how the room worked. James and Robert Pascal opened their luncheonette in 1947 at 837 West Hunter Street on the west side of Atlanta. They were from Thompson, Georgia, and they had both worked in hospitality before they opened anything of their own. When they started, there was no stove in the building. Neither brother owned a car. Robert cooked the hot food at his house and sent it across to the counter by taxi. Cold sandwiches and sodas at a 30-seat counter on Hunter Street, with the neighborhood passing outside the window all day long. They added hot food, then a real kitchen behind the counter, then a bigger dining room behind the kitchen. West Hunter Street in those years was one of the central corridors of Black Atlanta, a street where you could find everything you needed without crossing into neighborhoods where your presence was unwelcome. Pascal sat near the middle of that corridor, and it filled up fast. Workers stopped in before their shift started. Families came on Sundays after church. People ate at the counter and left, or they settled into booths and stayed for an hour and talked. By the late 1950s, the restaurant had become something beyond a place to eat. Atlanta's civil rights leadership had started coming in, because the food was worth coming back to, and because the space was private enough to talk freely. Andrew Young came in, John Lewis came in, Ralph Abernathy, Jesse Jackson, Julian Bond, Wyatt T. Walker. The private rooms in the back of the restaurant held conversations that shaped marches, organized the Atlanta student sit-ins at lunch counters across the city, and planned the logistics of the movement's push through Georgia. Journalists and historians would later call Pascal's the unofficial headquarters of the civil rights movement in Atlanta. The Pascal brothers never used that phrase themselves. It was simply where the work happened to get done, in between plates of fried chicken, black-eyed peas, and cornbread that people drove across the city for. The fried chicken at Pascal's was a particular thing. You could smell it from halfway down the block when the kitchen was running at full pace. The skin crisped hard enough to crack at the bite and stayed juicy all the way through the bone. The kitchen ran on family recipes and on discipline, because James Pascal believed that if you served something, you served it the same way every time. The collard greens came out with the slow, deep flavor of something that had been cooking long before you arrived. The peach cobbler had a crust that gave slightly under a spoon, and a filling that ran between syrup and jam. People ordered it at the end of a meal, and then sat there longer than they had planned. In 1960, the brothers opened La Carousel Lounge in the same complex. In the entirely segregated Atlanta of that era, La Carousel was the only formal nightclub in the city that welcomed black patrons through the front door. Aretha Franklin performed there. Dizzy Gillespie performed there. Nationally known acts moved through the lounge the same way civil rights leaders moved through the dining room across the hall. You could finish a plate of smothered chicken in the restaurant, push back from the table, walk 15 steps, and sit down to live music. The room held both things at once, the political work and the release from it, and neither felt out of place next to the other. In 1967, the Pascal brothers completed a 6-story, 125-room motor hotel on the same property. The total cost was $2 million. It was the first black-owned and operated motel in the city of Atlanta. The complex had a swimming pool, a banquet facility that seated 350, a second dining room with 160 seats, and a lounge that continued to draw performers from across the country. Room 101 in the hotel was set aside permanently for Dr. King's use, anytime he came through Atlanta. He did not have to call ahead to confirm it was available. It was available, that was understood. When Robert F. Kennedy came through Atlanta during his 1968 presidential campaign, he stayed at Pascal's Motor Hotel. When King was assassinated in Memphis that April, the restaurant placed a memorial in his corner booth. You did not sit there after that. No one said not to. It was simply understood. The kind of thing that a room teaches you without using words. What happened to Pascal's after that is the kind of story that takes a while to land. Clark Atlanta University purchased the original property from the brothers in 1996, intending to operate it as a conference center and preserve the history. They renamed it Pascal Center and kept a version of the restaurant going, But by July 2003, the university closed the restaurant, citing annual operating losses of $500,000 a year. Robert Paschal had died in 1997. James Paschal died not long after. The people who could have walked a journalist through the room and explained what each booth had meant to the movement were aging and scattered, and the room itself was going quiet. A newer Paschal's had opened in 2002, a few blocks away in the Castleberry Hill neighborhood, built by a developer who had partnered with James Paschal before his death. Same name on the sign, fried chicken on the menu. A Paschal's outlet later opened in Concourse B of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, where you could eat a plate of the food on the way to your gate. Critics who knew the original said the new locations were fine restaurants. They also said that walking into one felt nothing like walking into the building on West Hunter Street. When reporters visited the original building years after the closure, they found the windows shattered or missing, plywood boards covering the frames, advertisements for palm readers taped to the boards and the street-facing walls. Grass grew through the pavement in the parking area. The 125-room hotel that had housed a president's campaign and provided a permanent room to a civil rights leader looked, from the outside, like a building that had been forgotten by everyone who passed it. The Paschal brothers had built something at 837 West Hunter Street that a city could not quite replace and could not quite bring itself to properly mourn. The booth in the back left corner had no marking on it, had never had a marking on it, and now the building around it had no one inside it to tell you what the corner had once meant. A developer eventually purchased the property with plans for restoration. As of the early 2020s, the building remained vacant, its windows dark, the history inside it not recorded in any permanent way that a person passing on the street could read. That was simply how it went for Paschal's, not with a ceremony and not with a proper goodbye. The institution that fed the architects of the civil rights movement, that gave King a room of his own and a booth where he could think, that housed Aretha Franklin in one room and the planning of a march in the room beside it, ended with a university citing $500,000 a year in losses and a board vote nobody remembers the date of. The restaurant closed, the building sat, the neighborhood moved around it. You did not think about any of that when you were sitting in a booth there in 1965 or 1972 or 1988. You thought about whether you were getting the fried chicken or the smothered pork chops. You thought about whether there was any peach cobbler left. The booth belonged to Dr. King and you did not sit in it, and the collard greens were the best you had ever tasted, and those two facts lived inside the same room without ever needing an explanation. Nobody had to tell you how to act inside Paschal's. The room taught you, and then one day the room was gone. You just learned how a city could displace a gathering place without replacing what it meant. Next, a South Side Chicago institution that had been feeding the neighborhood since 1945, until the economy decided it had fed enough. Section 2. Army and Lou's. The smothered chicken came out on a plate that was heavier than you expected every single time. You knew it was coming. You had watched it land in front of other people at other tables. You had been there enough times to know exactly what the plate looked like from across the room. That particular shade of deep brown where the gravy had worked its way into every crease of the skin and pooled thick around the edges. And still, when the waitress set it down in front of you, the weight of it caught your hand slightly off guard. That was the thing about Army and Lou's on the south side of Chicago. Everything there was a little more than you had prepared yourself for. The restaurant opened in 1945 at 422 East 75th Street in the Chatham neighborhood, which made it one of the oldest black-owned restaurants in the entire Midwest. The name came from the original owners, Army and Louise, who built the place up from a neighborhood spot into something that drew people from every part of the city and then from well outside it. By the time you were sitting in one of those red linen tablecloth booths in the 1970s or 1980s, the place had been feeding that block for 30 years and the building wore it. The walls had photographs going back decades. The booths had the particular give of furniture that had absorbed that many years of Sunday afternoons. The room smelled of something slow-cooked and deep, greens with smoked ham hock and something sweet underneath that you could never quite identify before the plate arrived and you stopped trying to think about it. Chicago's South Side in those decades was one of the dense centers of Black American life in the country. The Great Migration had been bringing families up from Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Arkansas since the First World War, and those families had built neighborhoods that had their own institutions, their own economy, their own traditions. Army and Lou's sat inside all of that. Workers came in before their shift started. Families came in on Fridays when payday landed. After church on Sundays, the line sometimes ran out the door and partway down 75th Street, and nobody in that line seemed particularly bothered about it because the smothered chicken was worth whatever the wait turned out to be. The menu ran deep. Chitterlings, cleaned properly and prepared the way only a kitchen that had been doing it for decades could manage. Baby back ribs that came off the bone without resistance. Catfish that had been seasoned before it hit the oil and came out with a crust that shattered at the fork. Creole shrimp. Mixed greens with smoked ham hock that had been simmering since early in the morning. Peach cobbler with a top that was somewhere between crust and cake, and a filling that was warm all the way through. You did not order one thing at Army and Lou's and consider yourself done with the meal. The table filled up. That was understood. On Friday and Saturday evenings, the restaurant brought in jazz musicians. The music came from the corner where they set up, and it moved through the dining room at a volume that let you keep your conversation going while still feeling the room shift around it. People lingered longer on those nights. The plates cleared, but nobody rushed toward the door. The room held everyone together in a way that a room can only do when the food has already done its work. The famous people who came through Army and Lou's fill a list that takes a moment to absorb. Cab Calloway ate there. Muhammad Ali ate there. James Brown came through. Martin Luther King Jr. came through during his time organizing in Chicago in the mid-1960s. Harold Washington, who became Chicago's first black mayor in 1983, was a regular throughout the 1980s, and the restaurant knew his order before he finished sitting down. Jesse Jackson ate there. His son, Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr., ate there. Congressman Danny Davis was a regular. The rapper Common, who grew up on the South Side, has spoken about the restaurant as a fixed point in his memory of the neighborhood. None of those names made the food taste different to the people who came in on a Tuesday afternoon for the smothered chicken and nothing else. The room held celebrities, and it held the woman from 3 blocks over who came in every week and sat in the same booth, and it treated both the same way. That was part of the point of Army and Lou's. The red tablecloths were on every table. The plates were the same weight for everyone. What happened to Army and Lou's is the story of what happened to a lot of the South Side in the years between 1990 and 2010. Chicago lost more than 17% of its black population over that span, according to census records from that period. People moved. Families relocated to suburbs or to other cities. The base of regulars that had sustained a neighborhood restaurant through decades began to thin in ways that were hard to see coming and impossible to reverse quickly. A generation of patrons who had eaten at Army and Lou's since childhood aged past the point of coming in regularly. Their children and grandchildren, in many cases, had grown up in different neighborhoods or different cities entirely. The Sunday afternoon crowd got smaller. The Friday night crowd got smaller. The booths that used to fill by 6:30 stayed half empty past 7. A group of investors had come in to help stabilize the restaurant in the years before it closed, trying to find a way to keep it running. The effort was genuine, and it was not enough. On January 30th, 2011, Army and Lou's served its last meal after 65 years at 422 East 75th Street. Co-owner Goldie McDuffie told the Chicago Tribune that it had simply become too hard to stay open when the foot traffic was no longer there to support it. She described the closing as temporary, said she hoped new investors might step forward, and said farewell for now in a way that sounded like she was trying to leave a door open that she knew would not reopen. Harry Fleming, a former owner, told a reporter that when you lose the base that built a place, the next generation is not automatically there to carry it forward. It was, he said, losing a real strong sense of heritage. He said it quietly and without drama, the way you describe something that has simply become true. The building at 422 East 75th did not become another restaurant. The neighborhood around it had the kind of vacancy that accumulates when a city loses population, and the businesses built to serve those people follow them out the door. Army and Lou's had been a catering operation alongside the restaurant for years, and that continued briefly after the dining room closed. But the booths with the red tablecloths, the corner where the jazz musicians set up on weekends, the kitchen that had been running smothered chicken and peach cobbler since 1945, all of that stopped. You did not know, in 1985, that the plate in front of you would be one of the last 65 years of plates. You did not think of it as something to preserve or to document or to describe to anyone later. You thought about whether the cobbler was as good as last time and whether your grandmother was going to finish everything on her plate before you offered to help her. The red tablecloth was just the tablecloth. The weight of the plate was just the plate. The smell coming from the kitchen was just what the kitchen smelled like. There was nothing to mourn because nothing had ended yet. Army and Lou's was simply there. The way the block was there, the way the South Side was there, the way the city was there. And then, one Sunday in January 2011, it was not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You've seen what economic pressure did to 65 years on the South Side. Next, a West Side Chicago institution that fed the civil rights movement itself, and what happened when the woman running the kitchen was no longer there to run it. Section 3. Edna's Restaurant. The biscuits came out of the oven in a particular shade of gold that you do not arrive at by accident. It is the shade that happens when the temperature has been right and the timing has been right, and the hands that made them have made them so many times that the whole process has become a kind of muscle memory, something the body does without the mind having to supervise it. Edna Stewart's biscuits were that shade. People who ate at her restaurant on Madison Street on Chicago's West Side described them in different ways over the years, but the descriptions always landed on the same point, which was that the biscuit was light in a way that surprised you, and substantial in a way that stayed with you, and that it arrived at the table warm every time without exception, as though the oven knew when you were sitting down. Edna's restaurant opened in 1966 at 3715 West Madison Street, and its origin was the kind of story that could only have come out of the Great Migration and what it produced. Edna Stewart's parents were sharecroppers in Covington, Tennessee, and they moved to Chicago in 1936 when Edna was a small child. She grew up on the West Side, went to nursing school as a young woman, and was pointed toward a career in healthcare. What redirected her was her father. Samuel Mitchell Sr. decided, when Edna was in her late 20s, that he wanted to go into the restaurant business. What he needed was a cook. Edna and her then husband went in with him, and they opened the first location inside a bowling alley and dance hall, which meant they had customers from the moment they unlocked the door, because the people bowling needed to eat, and the food Edna put out gave them a reason to stay at the table longer than they had planned. The fried chicken was the thing that built the restaurant's reputation first. Edna had learned to cook from her Tennessee-born mother, and what that meant was a particular tradition, a way of seasoning and a way of managing heat and timing that had been practiced for generations before Edna's hands took it up. The chicken came out with a crust that had absorbed the seasoning all the way through it rather than sitting on top of it. The skin held its crunch past the point where you expected it to soften. The meat inside stayed moist all the way to the bone. People came in for the fried chicken and left talking about the cornbread, which was made in cast iron and came out with a bottom crust that had crisped slightly against the pan, and about the catfish, which was dredged in seasoned cornmeal and dropped into oil that was exactly the right temperature, and about the mac and cheese, which had a blistered top that cracked under a fork and a center that was as close to a sauce as anything you would properly call a baked dish. The restaurant also served collard greens without pork, which was unusual for a soul food kitchen in Chicago in those years. Edna had shifted to that preparation in response to the dietary preferences of her regular customers, some of whom were Muslim and needed the option. The greens were still long cooked and deep flavored, still the kind of thing that arrived at the table smelling of something that had been patient all morning. She had simply found a way to get there without the ingredient most kitchens considered mandatory. That was the kind of adaptation Edna's made, quietly and without making a point of it, because the purpose of the restaurant was always to feed whoever walked through the door in a way that was worth walking through the door for. What made Edna's something beyond a neighborhood restaurant was what happened in the mid-1960s, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. brought the civil rights movement to Chicago. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had launched the Chicago Freedom Movement in 1966, targeting housing segregation and economic inequality on the north and west sides. The organizing work centered on the west side, which put the headquarters of the movement a short distance from 3715 West Madison Street. Civil rights workers who needed to eat came to Edna's. King himself came in, Ralph Abernathy came in, Jesse Jackson came in, and then kept coming back through the following decades, to the point where the restaurant and Jackson's presence in it became one of the fixed facts of West Side political life. Edna fed movement workers at no charge when she could afford to, because she understood what the work required, and because the restaurant was on the West Side, and the West Side was where the organizing was happening, and you fed the people doing the work. The restaurant survived the 1968 riots that burned portions of the West Side after King's assassination. Much of Madison Street was destroyed in those days. Edna's building came through. The kitchen stayed open. The biscuits kept coming out of the oven in that particular shade of gold. And the neighborhood, which had been badly wounded and would take decades to recover, had the restaurant there when people needed somewhere to sit down. By the time you were eating at Edna's in the 1980s or 1990s, the photographs on the walls had accumulated into a record of everything that had moved through that kitchen. Jesse Jackson was up there. Local aldermen and state legislators who had eaten free as young organizers and kept coming back as elected officials were up there. The West Side regulars who had been there since 1966 were not on the walls but were in the booths, in the same seats they had been in for 25 years, ordering the same plates. Edna knew their names, she knew their orders. She knew when someone was not sitting in their usual seat, and she knew when someone had not been in for a while. That kind of knowledge about a community is not a feature of a restaurant. It is a feature of a person who has been paying close attention to the same neighborhood for 30 years. Governor Pat Quinn of Illinois declared February 19, 2010, Edna Stewart Day in the state of Illinois. She was 72 years old and had been running the restaurant for 44 years. 6 weeks later, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She died in June 2010. The restaurant had been her operation in a way that was total. She had run it with the kind of singular authority that meant every decision about the menu, the kitchen, the hours, and the character of the dining room had run through her. And when she was gone, the question of who could carry any of that forward did not have an obvious answer. Her immediate family did not have members in a position to take over the daily work. The restaurant closed in the weeks following her death, and the West Side lost the smell of her biscuits coming out of the oven on a weekday morning. There were fundraising efforts afterward. People who had eaten at Edna's for decades tried to find a way to keep the building open or find someone who could bring the kitchen back. Edna's former produce supplier, a man named Henry Henderson, eventually bought the business and reopened the space under the name Ruby's, making clear he intended to keep the recipes and the spirit of the place intact. He served the fried chicken the way Edna had served it, and the catfish the way Edna had served it, and he was open about the fact that what he was trying to do was carry something forward that had almost disappeared entirely. The kitchen at Ruby's was still the kitchen at 3715 West Madison. The biscuits were still baked in the same oven. Whether it was the same restaurant or a tribute to it was a question that did not have a clean answer, and most of the people who had eaten at Edna's for 20 or 30 years probably had their own private answer that they did not need to say out loud. You did not think about succession plans or ownership structures when you were sitting across from your mother at Edna's in 1978 with a plate of fried chicken and a piece of cornbread, and the room loud and warm around you. You thought about the food. You thought about where you were going afterward. The biscuit was warm, and it was exactly the right weight in your hand, and the kitchen behind the counter was running at full pace, and Edna Stewart was in there somewhere, paying attention to everything, and the restaurant would be there next Sunday the same way it was there today. That was simply how it was, until it wasn't. Edna's kitchen closed when the woman who built it was gone. Next, a South Side institution where the founding cook outlived her restaurant by years, watching from a distance as the place she built faded without her in it. Section 4. Isola's Restaurant. The round table near the back of the dining room was not available to everyone. No sign said that. No hostess explained it when you came in the door. You learned it the way you learned everything about a room like Isola's, which was by being there enough times and paying enough attention. The table near the back was where the people who ran things in Chicago's Chatham neighborhood sat down to talk, and if you were not one of those people, you understood without being told that you ordered from the counter and found a seat that wasn't that one. The politicians came in and took their places, and the room accommodated them the way rooms accommodate certain people, not through deference exactly, but through a kind of natural sorting that happens in spaces where everyone knows the order of things. And Isola White, who owned the restaurant at 522 East 79th Street, and had owned it for decades by then, knew everyone's name and everyone's order, and exactly how long they had been coming in, and she moved through the dining room with the authority of a woman who had built every inch of what you were sitting inside. Isola White was born in Kenton, Tennessee, and she came to Chicago in 1940, at the age of roughly 22, following the same corridor north that hundreds of thousands of black families from the Deep South and the border states were traveling in those years. She worked at a soda fountain at 61st and King Drive when she arrived. She took a job as a waitress at a restaurant on 61st Street called Vernola's. She learned how a dining room worked from the inside of a waitress's apron before she ever stood on the other side of the counter. In 1957, she opened Isola's Restaurant at 522 East 79th Street in Chatham, which placed her among the first black restaurant owners in the city of Chicago, and specifically among the first black women to own a restaurant in a city where that was a rare and difficult thing to be. The restaurant ran on soul food and on seafood, which was a combination that set Isola's slightly apart from the other South Side institutions in those years. The catfish came out fried in seasoned cornmeal, crisp through the skin and tender all the way to the center. The chicken and pork chops followed the Southern tradition Isola had grown up with, cooked through slowly in a way that filled the dining room with a smell that had settled into the walls over the years until it was simply part of what the building was. The liver and onions were a breakfast staple, and the shrimp bisque, which came out thick and faintly sweet, with a heat that arrived at the back of the throat a few seconds after the spoon, was something that people drove from other parts of the city specifically to eat. You did not come to Isola's with a light appetite. The portions were sized on the assumption that you had arrived hungry, and that the restaurant intended to resolve that problem completely. The room itself was covered in photographs. Signed portraits of Chicago politicians covered every wall from eye level upward, a visual record of who had eaten at that counter going back years. Harold Washington, who became Chicago's first black mayor in 1983, ate there, Eugene Sawyer, who became the city's second black mayor after Washington's death in 1987, ate there. Barack Obama, then running for a seat in the United States Senate, was hosted at Izola's in the early 2000s. Emil Jones Jr., who would become president of the Illinois State Senate, was a regular. Count Basie came in when he was in the city. The retired Chicago police officer Dwayne Mason, who later became Izola's legal guardian in the final years of her life, described the atmosphere of the room as one where everyone could hear everyone else's conversation, and everyone contributed back, and Isola was the referee. The food was good, he told the Chicago Sun-Times. The politics was good too. The restaurant was open 24 hours a day, every day of the week except for a few hours on Wednesdays when Isola closed the dining room for cleaning. That schedule meant that the room served the whole rhythm of Southside life, the early workers who came in before 5 in the morning, the after-church crowd on Sundays, the late-night people who needed something real to eat at 2 in the morning after the clubs on 79th Street had closed. Isola was known to be in the building for most of that time. She talked to customers the way she had always talked to them, as though the conversation mattered as much as the plate in front of you. She told the Chicago Sun-Times in 1988 that she tried to reach young people who came in, tried to talk to them, tried to say the things that parents said when parents were available to say them. She called it talking to a lot of kids and trying to get them straight, and she described it with the matter-of-fact authority of a woman who believed that a restaurant was also something more than a restaurant if you ran it with any seriousness. What happened to Isola White is one of the harder stories in this list, not because the restaurant burned down or got seized or was demolished by a city government that wanted the land for something else, but because the thing that ended it was the thing that can end any institution built around a single person with a singular capacity. Isola got sick. She began to have difficulty managing the restaurant's day-to-day operations, and she trusted people around her to help, and some of those people did not manage the business the way she would have managed it. By late 2010, the restaurant was in serious financial difficulty. It closed in December of that year, or by March of 2011 at the latest, depending on the source, and Isola herself had developed dementia significant enough that she could no longer return to the building she had run for more than 50 years. She was heartbroken by the closure, according to Mason, who had become her legal guardian and managed her affairs in the years after the restaurant shut. The dementia spread after the closing. She moved into a nursing home. A fundraiser organized by people from the community in September 2011 raised $12,000 for her care, but $35,000 was needed for legal fees, back rent, storage, and living expenses. Mason was direct in his assessment of who had failed to show up for Isola White in those years. He told reporters that not one black elected official had stepped forward to help her in any meaningful way. Many of them had eaten at her restaurant for free across the decades, he said. When she needed them most, they had let her down. He said it without apparent surprise, just as a fact he had watched happen. The space at 522 East 79th was eventually taken over by another black-owned soul food restaurant called Luversia's, which opened in the spring of 2011 and tried to carry something of the tradition forward in the same building. The signed portraits of politicians remained on the walls. The kitchen was still the kitchen. But the round table near the back was just a table again, and the woman who had known for 50 years exactly who sat there and what they ordered and how long they had been coming in was living in a nursing home on the other side of the city, unable to return. Isola White died in April 2018 at Holy Cross Hospital in Chicago. She was 95 years old. She had outlived her restaurant by 7 years and spent most of those years in a room she had not chosen, away from the counter and the kitchen and the walls covered in photographs and the round table in the back where Chicago's political class had sat for decades, while she moved through the dining room and kept track of everything. You did not know any of that in 1979 when you were sitting at a table near the window with the shrimp bisque cooling slightly in the bowl in front of you, and the room full and loud around you and Isola somewhere behind the counter where she always was. The restaurant was simply there, the way the South Side was there, the way the signed portraits on the wall had always been there. You ate the bisque. You ordered the cornbread. You did not think about what happened to things like this when the person holding them together was no longer able to hold them. Nobody had to explain any of it. Not yet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You've now seen 2 Chicago institutions that closed when the women who built them could no longer stand behind the counter. Next, a South Side restaurant that outlasted its founder by decades, right up until a health inspection, a license that couldn't be transferred, and a city that moved on without it. Section 5. Soul Queen Restaurant. The sweet potato pie arrived on a plate that had nothing else on it, which was how you knew Helen Maybelle Anglin understood what she was doing. Other restaurants put the pie at the corner of the dinner plate, or brought it out as an afterthought alongside a scoop of something, as though the pie needed company or needed to be diminished by proximity to another thing. At Soul Queen on the south side of Chicago, the sweet potato pie came on its own plate, at its own moment in the meal, because Helen Maybelle Anglin had decided somewhere in the decades she spent behind a counter that the pie deserved the space to be what it was. The filling was dense without being heavy, sweet without crossing into cloying, and the crust had the particular quality of something that had been rolled and handled by someone who had done it so many times that the motion had stopped being a decision and become something closer to breathing. You ate it and you understood immediately why it had its own plate. Helen Maybelle Anglin was from Alabama, and she had come to Chicago the same way most of the South Side came to Chicago, following the Great Migration north in search of work and a life that was not structured entirely around the labor arrangements of the rural South. She got into the restaurant business in the late 1940s with her first husband, Hubert Maybelle. Their first place was called the H&H Cafe at 125 East 51st Street, and it opened with 3 stools. 3 stools is almost not a restaurant. It is a counter with the idea of a restaurant attached to it. But the cafe grew, and the 3 stools became 7, and the 7 became 10, and eventually a booth appeared, and the H&H Cafe became a place people came to intentionally rather than incidentally. After her divorce in 1969, Helen went on her own. 2 years later, in 1971, she opened Soul Queen Restaurant at 22nd Street and Michigan Avenue. She named it after herself in a way, because she had decided she was the Soul Queen of Chicago's South Side, and that the restaurant was the proof of that claim, and the food she put out for the next 38 years did nothing to argue against the title. The restaurant eventually moved to 9031 South Stony Island Avenue, which is where it became the version of itself that most people in Chicago knew and remembered. The menu at Soul Queen was built around the things that Chicago's Black South Side had been eating since the Great Migration delivered all those Tennessee and Mississippi and Alabama kitchens to a northern city, and Helen Maybelle Anglin had grown up inside that tradition long enough to know how every dish was supposed to taste before she made it. The fried chicken came out with a seasoning that went into the meat rather than stopping at the skin. The short ribs were braised down to the point where the meat had given everything it had to give to the liquid around it, and the liquid had thickened into something you put over everything else on the plate. The fresh greens had the deep, slow flavor that only comes from time and attention and a refusal to rush. There was also macaroni and cheese that people across the city spoke about with the kind of specificity reserved for food that made a genuine impression, and a cornbread that had a faint sweetness that balanced whatever heat was in the rest of the meal. The restaurant ran a buffet that became one of its defining features, a long table of Soul Queen standards where you paid a price and ate until the decision to stop was yours alone. The buffet drew families on Sundays after church and drew workers on weekday lunches and drew politicians and judges and local celebrities who came not because it was a place to see or be seen, but because the food was exactly what they wanted to eat, and no other restaurant in the area put it out quite the same way. Helen Maybelle Anglin worked the room the way she had always worked rooms, moving through the dining area with the authority of a woman who had built it and knew every table in it, talking to the people eating, asking about their families, remembering the details of conversations from weeks earlier. The walls of the restaurant held photographs of the people who had passed through it across the years, not because anyone had organized a collection, but because people had been giving Helen Maybelle Anglin their photographs for decades, and she had put them up because she wanted the room to hold the record of everyone who had eaten there. The entertainers came through Soul Queen the way entertainers came through every significant black-owned restaurant in Chicago during those years. The South Side had its own entertainment economy, its own clubs and venues and circuits, and the performers who moved through that world needed to eat after their sets the way performers always need to eat after their sets, and a restaurant that stayed open late and put out the kind of food Soul Queen put out became a natural end to the night. The politicians were a different kind of regular. Southside politics ran through restaurants the way it runs through barbershops and churches, in the conversations that happen at tables where nobody is taking notes. Soul Queen had the table for those conversations, and the conversations happened there for decades. What ended Soul Queen was not economic pressure, and not a city that wanted the land for something else. What ended Soul Queen was a health inspection in July of 2008, which found violations significant enough for the Chicago Department of Health to suspend the restaurant's operating license. The inspectors had received a complaint from a patron who reported seeing mice on the premises. The inspection found no live mice, but found extensive evidence throughout the kitchen, dining room, and storage areas. They also found food being stored above the required 40-degree threshold. They found a leaky automatic dishwasher spilling dirty water across the kitchen floor. They found raw sewage backing up through a floor drain near the hand-washing sink. They found no certified food manager on duty. They found the outside dumpster overflowing with trash. The health department's public information officer told the Chicago Defender at the time that it was a shame that a restaurant with such a rich history had found itself in that position. Helen Maybelle Anglin did not return calls seeking comment. A spokesperson for the department said the violations needed to be corrected before the restaurant could reopen, and that reinspection would follow within 48 hours of notification that the problems had been addressed. Employees at Soul Queen, who asked not to be identified, told the Defender the restaurant was working on the corrections and planned to reopen. Soul Queen did reopen. Helen Maybelle Anglin was in her late 70s by then, and the restaurant continued through the following year. Then, on September 8, 2009, she died of multiple organ failure at her daughter's home in Lansing. She was 80 years old. She had been in the restaurant business in one form or another since the late 1940s, which meant she had spent 60 years feeding the South Side, first at 3 Stools on 51st Street, and eventually at a full dining room on Stony Island, where the sweet potato pie came out on its own plate, because she had decided that was the right way to serve it. Her daughter told the Chicago Defender that the restaurant would remain closed, in part because the business license Helen Maybelle Anglin had held was non-transferable. The license belonged to her, specifically to her, and when she was gone, the license was gone with her. A new owner could apply for a new license, could reopen the space under a new name or the same name, could try to rebuild what had been there. But the restaurant that Helen Maybelle Anglin had named after herself, the one that had been operating in one form or another since 1971, ended the day she did. Her daughter said it plainly. Soul Queen was her legacy, and that was how she wanted to be remembered. She said it would, in a sense, be buried with her. The building on South Stony Island stood after that. The photographs on the walls stayed up for a while. The kitchen equipment was still in the kitchen. But the license was gone, and the woman who had held it was gone, and the sweet potato pie that came out on its own plate because the woman making it believed it deserved that much was gone with her. You did not know, the last time you ate there, that it was the last time. Nobody ever does. You've watched the South Side lose 3 institutions in succession, each one for a different reason, each one unreplaceable in the same way. Next, a Bronzeville restaurant that had been feeding that neighborhood since the 1940s, for 52 years, until the woman who built it could no longer stand up long enough to cook. Section 6. Gladys's Luncheonette. The peach cobbler at Gladys's Luncheonette in Bronzeville had a particular quality that people who ate it in the 1970s and 1980s still reach for words to describe correctly. It was not the filling exactly, though the filling was exactly right. The peaches soft and syrupy and warm all the way through, in a way that meant they had been in the oven long enough to surrender completely to the heat. It was not the crust exactly, though the crust had that particular combination of density and tenderness that comes from a recipe handled the same way for so long that the proportions have stopped being measurements and become instinct. What people always came back to, when they tried to describe the cobbler at Gladys's Luncheonette, was that eating it felt like being inside someone's home kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in October. Not like a restaurant's approximation of that feeling, like the actual feeling, like the actual kitchen. Like you were not a customer who had paid for something, but a person who had been invited somewhere and fed accordingly. You did not get that from a recipe. You got it from 50 years of practice and from a woman named Gladys Holcomb who had been feeding Bronzeville since before most of her customers had been born. Gladys's Luncheonette first opened in the 1940s on State Street, in the heart of what was then one of the densest and most vibrant corridors of Black Chicago. The State Street Strip in those years was the commercial and social spine of Bronzeville, the neighborhood that the Great Migration had built into what journalists and sociologists of the era called the Black Metropolis, a city within the city, with its own economy and its own institutions, and its own version of everything a neighborhood needed to sustain itself. The Luncheonette sat inside all of that, a counter and a kitchen where Gladys Holcomb put out the food she had grown up with, and where the neighborhood found out quickly that the food she put out was worth coming back to. In 1963, the Luncheonette moved from State Street to 4527 South Indiana Avenue, still in Bronzeville, settling into the location that would define it for the rest of its operating life. The neighborhood around Indiana Avenue in those years was working through the same shifts that were reshaping Black Chicago broadly, the pressures of urban renewal and highway construction, and the movement of middle-class families to different parts of the city. But the Luncheonette itself was a fixed point in all of that movement. People came back. People who had moved to other neighborhoods on the South Side came back on weekends. People who had moved to the suburbs came back when they were in the city. The address on Indiana Avenue became the address that families gave to people who had not yet been there, written on a piece of paper or passed by word of mouth, the way the addresses of essential places always get passed. The menu was built around the full range of soul food at its most carefully executed. The fried chicken had a crust that crackled audibly at the table, loud enough that the people around you could hear it when you broke into a piece, and the skin had absorbed whatever Gladys Holcomb put into her seasoning in a way that meant the flavor was in the chicken rather than sitting on top of it. The smothered chicken was a different preparation and a different experience. The same bird braised down under a gravy that had been cooked long enough to develop a depth that the fried version did not have. Softer in the mouth, heavier on the plate, the kind of thing that asks something of you in return for eating it. The smothered pork chops followed the same logic as the smothered chicken, slow cooked under the same gravy until the meat had given everything it had to offer. The biscuits, which the Illinois General Assembly would later describe specifically and formally in the resolution it passed in Gladys Holcomb's honor, were what people talked about when they talked about the restaurant to someone who had never been. Melt in your mouth was the phrase the resolution used, which is the kind of phrase that gets used so often it stops meaning anything, except that in this case the people in the Illinois legislature who wrote it had most of them actually eaten those biscuits and knew the phrase was accurate. The banana pie was the other thing. A popular musician's hangout was how the restaurant was described in later years, and the banana pie was part of why musicians came back. Something about the filling, which was smooth and cold and dense with flavor, and the crust, and the proportion of the whole thing, made it the kind of dessert that people who were not dessert people ordered and then sat quietly for a moment after the first bite. Red Fox ate at Gladys's luncheonette and kept coming back. Lou Rawls came in, Della Reese came in, Gladys Knight, whose name was the same as the woman running the kitchen, and whose fame would eventually attach to a different restaurant in Atlanta, ate at the luncheonette when she was in Chicago. Governor Jim Thompson, a white Republican governor of Illinois, ate there, which meant that Gladys Holcomb's dining room held the full range of people who passed through Chicago in those decades and needed somewhere real to eat. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came in during his time organizing on the West Side in the mid-1960s. Reverend Jesse Jackson was a regular across the years. Negro League baseball players came in when they were in the city, and the tables filled up around them the same way tables filled up around everyone else, because the room did not treat anyone differently based on who they were. The luncheonette ran for roughly 52 years. In 1996, Gladys Holcomb's health failed to the point where she could no longer run the kitchen, and the restaurant closed. She had been the kitchen. The two things were not separable in any meaningful way. When she could not cook, there was no Gladys's luncheonette, because the luncheonette was the expression of her particular knowledge and her particular hands and her particular sense of what a plate of food owed to the person who had ordered it. 52 years of that knowledge lived in her, and not in a manual or a recipe book or a set of instructions that could be handed to someone else and produce the same result. When she stepped back from the kitchen stopped. She died in 2003. The Illinois General Assembly passed a resolution in her honor afterward, naming specifically the fried chicken and the smothered chicken and the smothered pork chops and the peach cobbler and the melt-in-your-mouth biscuits and the other down-home Southern delicacies, and naming the luminaries who had eaten there, running through the list of politicians and performers and civil rights leaders the way you run through the names of people at a funeral when you are trying to account for the size of what has been lost. The resolution was a piece of paper. The luncheonette was 52 years of a woman feeding a neighborhood the things it needed to eat. In 2012, a demolition crew came to 4527 South Indiana Avenue and took down what remained of the building. By then it had been sitting vacant for years, the kitchen cold and the counter empty, and the booths where Red Fox and Lou Rawls and Martin Luther King Jr. had sat, slowly giving way to whatever happens to furniture in an abandoned building when no one is looking after it. The demolition was not a ceremony. It was a crew with equipment on a Monday morning, doing the work of removing something that was no longer serving any purpose in its current form. The peach cobbler that tasted like being inside someone's home kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in October was already long gone. The building was the last part of Gladys's luncheonette to disappear, and it disappeared without a marker or a plaque or a sign that told the people passing on Indiana Avenue what had stood there for 52 years and what it had meant to the people who had eaten inside it. You did not think about any of that the last time you sat in one of those booths and ate the smothered chicken and ordered the banana pie. You thought about whether you had room for the pie. You probably did not have room and you ordered it anyway, because you knew from experience that you would find the room, and that the room you found for the banana pie at Gladys's luncheonette on Indiana Avenue was always the right decision. Nobody had to tell you that. You already knew. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 52 years on Indiana Avenue, gone without a marker on the wall. Next, a Milwaukee institution that did not close because the food was wrong or the customers stopped coming. It closed because a national corporation arrived and the math stopped working in a way that had nothing to do with the cooking. Section 7. Big Mike's Ghetto Drive-In. The speaker box crackled when you pulled up to it. A little burst of static before the voice came through to take your order, and you rolled down the window and felt the contrast between the warm interior of the car and the Milwaukee air outside, and you leaned toward the box and said what you wanted and waited. The tray came out on a hook that clipped to the top of your window, and the food sat on it in paper wrapping and in cardboard and in cups with lids, and you ate in the car with the engine running or with the engine off depending on how cold the night was, and the parking lot was full of other cars doing the same thing, other families inside other windows, the lot lit up and the speakers going, and the kitchen behind the counter turning out orders one after another. A black-owned drive-in in Milwaukee in the mid-1960s was a particular kind of institution, one that had its own rhythm and its own rules and its own relationship to the neighborhood it sat inside, and Big Mike's Ghetto Drive-In on the north side was the version of that institution that Milwaukee's black community built for itself during the years when the neighborhood was still full enough and economically intact enough to sustain it. Milwaukee's north side in those years was what the Great Migration had produced in a Midwestern city that most people outside Wisconsin did not think of as a destination for black families moving north, but it was. Families had been coming up from Mississippi and Alabama and Arkansas since the First World War, following the same labor corridors that led other families to Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland, drawn by the steel mills and the meat packing plants and the manufacturing work that the industrial Midwest offered in those decades. By the 1950s and into the 1960s, Milwaukee's north side had become a dense, functioning black community with its own commercial corridors, its own churches and barbershops and beauty salons and restaurants, its own version of everything a neighborhood needed to sustain itself through a week and through a year and through a generation. The drive-in fit inside that landscape, because the drive-in was what the post-war moment had produced as a form of American restaurant, the car culture that had remade the country after the Second World War, remade how people ate outside their homes, and the drive-in was the architecture of that remaking. You did not park and go inside. You pulled up, and the food came to you, and the lot was the dining room, and your car was the booth, and the speaker box was the waiter. Black neighborhoods had their own versions of this form, black-owned drive-ins that served the community and operated inside the same commercial logic as their white counterparts on the other side of the city, with the specific difference that a black-owned drive-in in a black neighborhood was also a statement about what the neighborhood was capable of building and sustaining for itself. Mike Whatley built Big Mike's with that understanding. He was a social activist and a close associate of the comedian and civil rights advocate Dick Gregory, which meant he understood that a black-owned business was not only a commercial enterprise but a political fact, a piece of evidence in the argument that the community could support its own institutions if the institutions were given the conditions to operate. He put the word ghetto in the name of his restaurant without apology, in the same period when Ghetto Burger and similar names were appearing on menus across black urban America as an act of self-naming, a refusal to let the language of condescension belong only to the people who had invented it to condescend. The name said, "This is who we are, and where we are, and what we built here." You could eat the food or you could not eat the food. The name was not going to change. What happened to Big Mike's Ghetto Drive-In was not what happened to the Chicago restaurants in the previous sections of this list. It was not the death of the owner, or the decline of her health, or the loss of the license, or the failure of a city to show up when the building needed help. What happened to Big Mike's was structural, invisible to anyone eating in the parking lot, and it was happening to black-owned restaurants all across the country at the same moment in the late 1960s, when the national fast food chains began their rapid spread into American neighborhoods, and the economics of food service changed in ways that a small, independent operator could not absorb. The fast food chains were built on a logic of scale, because they bought in enormous quantities and operated across hundreds or thousands of locations. Their cost per unit for ingredients was dramatically lower than what an independent operator could access. A single drive-in on Milwaukee's north side bought from local suppliers and paid the prices that a small volume customer pays. The chains bought from national distributors and paid the prices that an organization purchasing millions of pounds of beef a year could negotiate. That gap in ingredient cost meant that the chain could price its food below what the independent operator could match, while still maintaining a profit margin that the independent could not achieve at the same price point. But the gap at Big Mike's was not only about volume. Mike Whatley described to reporters afterwards something more specific and more direct than a general market disadvantage. His meat supplier had capped his credit at $100. $100 of credit, at a time when the restaurant needed to buy consistently and needed the flexibility that credit provides to manage the gap between purchasing supplies and collecting revenue from customers. White business owners dealing with the same supplier, Whatley said, could run their bills up to $3,000 or $4,000 before the supplier cut them off. The difference was not about creditworthiness in any measurable sense. It was about who the supplier was willing to extend credit to and who it was not, and the answer followed a line that had nothing to do with the business performance of the people on either side of it. That was the mechanism. Not the stated reason, perhaps, but the operating reality. A restaurant that cannot buy supplies on credit in quantities that match its need cannot compete with a restaurant that can. The disadvantage compounded over time, because every week that Big Mike's paid premium prices for lower quantities was a week that the margin got thinner, and the gap between what he could charge and what the chain down the street was charging got harder to close. Whatley was clear about this when he explained the closure afterward. He could not compete with a national corporation. The math did not work, and the math did not work in a specific and traceable way. What complicated the story, and what Whatley himself acknowledged, was that the nearby McDonald's franchise he identified as his direct competition was not, in fact, owned by a white corporation in any simple sense. The franchise was owned by two black men, one of them Wayne Embry, a former player with the Milwaukee Bucks. Embry had been among the first black players in the NBA, had retired from playing, and had gone into business, and the Milwaukee McDonald's franchise was part of that business. The corporation that granted the franchise was white. The franchise model, the supply chain, the pricing structure, the marketing, the national advertising that made the golden arches recognizable before you could read the sign, all of that belonged to a white corporate entity. But the man across the street taking market share from Big Mike's was also a black man who had built something for himself within the structure available to him. That is the kind of complexity that does not resolve cleanly into a simple story about race and business. What it does resolve into is a story about infrastructure. Wayne Embry's McDonald's had access to the supply chain, the credit, the pricing power, and the brand recognition of a national corporation. Mike Whatley's drive-in had access to a supplier who capped his credit at $100. The individual ownership of the competing restaurant was almost beside the point. The systems behind the two restaurants were not equivalent, and the systems were what determined who stayed open. Big Mike's Ghetto Drive-In closed in the late 1960s. Milwaukee's North Side lost another piece of what it had built for itself during the decades of the Great Migration. Another institution that had fed the neighborhood and given it a place to be itself, gone before the neighborhood had worked out how to hold on to things like that once the economic ground shifted under them. You pulled up to the speaker box and rolled down the window, and the lot was full, and the food was right, and the night was Milwaukee cold, and the tray hooked to your window, and none of that felt like something that needed to be saved, until it was already gone. A corporate supply chain ended Big Mike's before the neighborhood knew what had hit it. Next, a Macon, Georgia institution that fed 2 generations of families and made the Allman Brothers famous for something other than their guitar playing, until a health closure and a succession problem ended 54 years in a single season. Section 8. H&H Restaurant. The collard greens had been on the stove since before you arrived, and they would be on the stove after you left, and the smell of them moved through the front door of the restaurant on Forsyth Street in downtown Macon, Georgia, and met you on the sidewalk before you had even reached for the handle. Not the sharp, grassy smell of greens that have not cooked long enough, which is the smell of a kitchen that is in a hurry. The smell coming out of H&H Restaurant was the smell of greens that had been going since early morning, slow and patient in a pot with whatever Inez Hill had decided they needed that day, the smell turning deep and low and slightly smoky, the smell of something that had been given enough time to become what it was supposed to be. You walked in through that smell and sat down, and whatever else was on the menu became secondary for a moment because the room had already told you that the person running the kitchen understood what time was for. Inez Hill opened H&H Restaurant in 1959 on Forsyth Street in downtown Macon. She was known to everyone who ate there as Mama Hill, which was not a title she had applied to herself, but one the restaurant had generated on its own, the way certain rooms generate names for the people who run them based on how those people treat the people inside them. Her co-owner was Louise Hudson, known as Mama Louise, and the two women built the restaurant together from the ground up, which in 1959 in Macon, Georgia, meant building it inside a set of constraints that had nothing to do with the quality of the food or the character of the women running the kitchen. Downtown Macon was a segregated city. The restaurant served the black community that the segregated city had organized around the corridors where black-owned businesses were permitted to operate, and it did so with the particular discipline of an institution that understood it was providing something essential to people who did not have an abundance of alternatives. The menu was the full vocabulary of Southern soul food, executed by two women who had grown up inside that tradition long enough to know every dish in it from the inside out. The fried chicken had the kind of crust that holds its integrity past the point where you expect it to give, seasoned through rather than seasoned on top, the skin crackling at the table loud enough that the people nearby could hear it. The smothered pork chops came out under a gravy that had the weight and the color of something long cooked, the pork itself having surrendered completely to the heat and the liquid around it. The macaroni and cheese had a top that blistered in the oven, and a center that was softer than it looked, the kind of dish that people ordered even when they had no room left because the room always materialized when the plate arrived. The cornbread came in slabs, not in the thin, dry wedges that some kitchens put out as an afterthought, but in actual slabs with a bottom crust that had crisped against the pan and a top that was slightly soft and yielding at the center. The collard greens were what the smell on the sidewalk had promised. They were worth the walk. Macon in the late 1960s was a music city in a way that people outside Georgia did not always fully understand. Otis Redding had grown up there and launched his career there before his death in 1967. James Brown had come up through the Augusta-Macon corridor. Little Richard was from Macon and had started singing in the churches and clubs there as a teenager. The city had a particular relationship with Black American music that went deeper than the famous names, a relationship built into the clubs and the churches and the recording studios and the culture of the place. When a group of young white musicians arrived in Macon in 1969 and signed with Capricorn Records and began building what would become the Allman Brothers Band, they were entering a city that had been shaped by black music and black musicians for decades, and the restaurant that the black community had been eating at on Forsyth Street for 10 years was a natural part of the world they were moving through. Dwayne Allman, Greg Allman, and the rest of the band were young and broke and hungry in the way that young musicians are young and broke and hungry, which is specifically and not metaphorically. They needed to eat, and they did not always have the money to eat. Inez Hill and Louise Hudson fed them. The two women fed the Allman Brothers when the band could not pay, which in the early years of the band's time in Macon was a regular condition, rather than an occasional one. They fed them the fried chicken and the collard greens and the cornbread and the smothered pork chops that the regular customers of H&H Restaurant were eating, and they did it without making a production of the generosity, because that was simply how Mama Hill and Mama Louise ran their kitchen. If you were hungry and you were in front of them, they fed you. The accounting of whether you could afford it was a secondary consideration, sometimes not a consideration at all. The band became famous. Allman Brothers albums sold in numbers that nobody at Capricorn Records had originally projected, and the band's association with Macon became part of their identity, and the story of Mama Hill and Mama Louise feeding them when they were broke became part of the band's mythology, in the way that origin stories become mythology when the people involved become famous enough for people to want to know how they started. Dwayne Allman died in a motorcycle accident in Macon in October 1971. Barry Oakley, the band's bassist, died in another motorcycle accident in Macon 13 months later, within blocks of where Dwayne had died. The band kept going, and the restaurant on Forsyth Street kept going, and the two things were connected in the memory of the city in a way that neither the band nor the restaurant had planned for, but that both had to live with. Molly Hatchet came through H&H. The Wet Willie Band came through H&H. Musicians who were trying to build something in the southern rock scene that Macon had made possible came to Forsyth Street and ate the fried chicken and the greens and the cornbread, and sat in the same dining room where the regular South Side working families and the downtown office workers and the civil rights leaders of Macon had been eating for years. The restaurant held all of them without distinguishing much between them. The plates were the same plates. The food was the same food. Mama Hill and Mama Louise fed whoever came through the door, which was what they had always done. H&H Restaurant became a destination as the Allman Brothers' fame grew. People came specifically because of the band connection, came to sit in the dining room where the musicians had eaten for free in the years before they could afford to pay. A pilgrimage quality attached itself to the address on Forsyth Street, the kind of thing that happens to places associated with American music history, where the place becomes a site of memory that people feel compelled to visit in order to stand inside the same walls. Tourism arrived alongside the regular neighborhood customers, which changed the character of the dining room in incremental ways without changing what came out of the kitchen. Inez Hill died. Louise Hudson eventually stepped away. The restaurant continued past both of them, running on the momentum of 54 years of operation and on the reputation that two women who fed musicians for free had built without intending to build anything beyond a good meal at a fair price. By 2013, the restaurant had reached a point that it could not sustain itself under the ownership structure that remained, and it closed. In 2014, a Macon-based business group called the Moonhanger Group purchased the restaurant and reopened it. The name stayed, the address stayed. The fried chicken stayed on the menu. What did not stay was the ownership that Inez Hill and Louise Hudson had held for 54 years, the black women's hands and black women's knowledge that had built the reputation the new owners were purchasing along with the building. The restaurant that tourists came to visit because of what Mama Hill and Mama Louise had done was now operating under different management, and the mathematics of that transaction were not complicated. On Forsyth Street, the smell of the collard greens still came through the door when the kitchen was running. The women who had been patient enough to cook them that way were already gone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You've seen how a restaurant built on 54 years of feeding musicians and families alike can be separated from the women who built it. Next, a celebrity named Atlanta institution that fed the city for nearly 20 years before a family dispute, a tax raid, and a revoked license ended it on the same afternoon. Section 9. Gladys Knight's Chicken and Waffles. The waffle came out golden in a way that was almost architectural. The grid of squares pressed deep and even, each one holding whatever you poured into it, without letting go until the moment you pressed a fork through it. The butter melted into the squares fast, and the syrup followed the butter, and both of them disappeared into the waffle the way liquid disappears into something that was made specifically to receive it. And then the chicken arrived on the same plate, fried hard and seasoned all the way through, and the combination of the two things, the sweet and the salt and the soft and the crisp, was the thing that people who had never eaten chicken and waffles together before always had to sit with for a moment after the first bite. Not because it was strange, because it was immediately obvious that the two things belonged together, that whoever had first put them on the same plate had understood something about how flavors balance that took everyone else a moment to catch up to. At Gladys Knight's Chicken and Waffles in Midtown Atlanta, that moment of catching up happened for thousands of people across nearly 2 decades, and the restaurant that produced it became one of the city's most recognizable institutions before it became one of the city's most dramatic closures. The restaurant opened in 1997 at 618 Ponce de Leon Avenue in Midtown, and the opening was not quiet. Mayor Bill Campbell came, Aaliyah came, Genuine was there. The name above the door belonged to one of the most recognizable voices in the history of American music, a woman who had grown up in Atlanta and whose career stretched back to the early 1960s. And the combination of that name, that neighborhood, and that particular menu drew a crowd from the first week that never entirely thinned out for years afterward. The lines on weekends went out the door and along the sidewalk, and the people in the lines were not only tourists or visitors who had read about the place in a travel guide, they were Atlanta people, South Side people, church people on Sundays who wanted something real after service. Musicians and athletes and politicians who needed a table where the food was right and the atmosphere was warm, and the room felt like Atlanta rather than like a restaurant that had been designed to feel like Atlanta. Gladys Knight's name was on the building through a licensing agreement she had entered into with her son, Shanga Hankerson, who owned and operated the restaurants. She gave him permission to use her name and likeness in exchange for monthly royalties, and Hankerson built the operation into something the city genuinely claimed as its own. A second location opened, then a third, spreading across the Atlanta metro area. The menu held the kind of items that got names. The midnight train was a plate of southern fried jumbo chicken wings with an original waffle, named for the night song that had been a #1 hit in 1973, and that every person who grew up listening to black music in America knew from the first note. Ordering it felt like a small act of belonging. You said the name and the kitchen heard it, and the plate came out, and the room was full, and the music in the background was right, and the chicken and the waffle were exactly what you had wanted, without knowing you wanted exactly that, until the moment the plate landed. By 2016, something had gone wrong in ways that were not visible from the dining room, but were accumulating behind it. In February of that year, the Peachtree Street location failed a health inspection with a score of 56 out of 100. Fulton County inspectors had found 15 violations, which is not a number that suggests a kitchen that is mostly functioning and has a couple of problems to address. It is a number that suggests a kitchen that has been allowed to drift significantly from the standards a functioning kitchen requires, and that the drift had been going on long enough to produce 15 distinct findings. The score was reported in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The city took notice. In June 2016, the Georgia Department of Revenue executed search warrants at all 3 restaurant locations and at the corporate headquarters. Agents arrived with the warrants and posted notice, and the restaurants closed on the spot, all 3 of them simultaneously, in the middle of the afternoon. Shanga Hankerson was arrested on 2 counts of felony theft by taking. The investigation alleged that he had taken a total of $650,000 in state sales taxes and withholding taxes that the restaurants had collected from customers and employees and that were legally required to be forwarded to the state. With penalties and interest, the total obligation exceeded $1 million. He was released from Clayton County Jail on a $20,000 bond. The restaurants briefly reopened under state receivership, which meant the state was overseeing the operation while the legal situation worked itself out. Then, in August 2016, the Lithonia location closed again, this time for good, with the receiver stating that the location was not generating enough revenue to sustain itself under the receivership structure. 1 location down, 2 remaining, and the legal situation getting worse rather than better. Gladys Knight filed suit in August 2016. She demanded that Hankerson stop using her name and her likeness in the restaurants, citing the declining state of the operation and his ongoing legal troubles as grounds for ending the licensing agreement. She formally terminated the agreement in July 2016, 1 month after the Department of Revenue raids. Hankerson's legal response to his mother's lawsuit argued that she lacked the mental capacity to terminate the agreement, which is a particular kind of legal argument that the people who read about it in the newspapers understood immediately as something beyond a legal argument. Knight was a Grammy-winning artist with a career spanning 6 decades. Her spokesperson told reporters she was praying that her son could get things worked out. The restaurant was renamed World Famous Chicken and Waffles. The midnight train stayed on the menu under the new name. Most of the people in Atlanta still called it Gladys's. The signage changed and the institutional memory did not, because institutional memory does not update on the schedule that signage does. You had spent years telling people to meet you at Gladys's before church or after the game, and changing the name above the door did not change the shorthand that the city had developed for the address on Peachtree Street. In February 2017, the Georgia Department of Revenue returned. Agents posted a letter on the door of the Midtown location stating that the restaurant's registration had been revoked due to tax issues. The specific finding was that Hankerson had continued to collect sales tax from customers and had continued not to forward it to the state after his earlier arrest and the arrangement that had theoretically resolved the first round of obligations. The Department of Revenue's Josh Waits told reporters that he had had more than enough chances. The letter on the door meant the restaurant could not legally collect the sales tax required to operate, which meant it could not legally operate. The Midtown Atlanta restaurant sat with the letter on the door. Within months, the space was boarded up. Trash accumulated in the doorway. The sign that had once read Gladys Knight's Chicken and Waffles and then read World Famous Chicken and Waffles gave way to the particular blankness of a shuttered storefront on a busy street, which is a blankness that Midtown Atlanta produces in abundance because Midtown Atlanta moves fast and does not pause to observe what has just closed. The original location on Ponce de Leon, the one where Mayor Campbell and Aaliyah and Genuine had come to the opening night in 1997, was also gone. The Lithonia location was gone. The Peachtree Street location was boarded. All 3 closed within roughly a year of the first raid, and the mechanism of the closure was not a city exercising eminent domain, or an economy that had hollowed out a neighborhood, or an owner who had grown too old to keep the kitchen running. The mechanism was a son who had taken money that belonged to the state, and a mother who had watched her name become associated with things she could not endorse, and a Department of Revenue that had arrived in the middle of the afternoon with search warrants and not left until the lights were off. 20 years of Sunday after-church crowds. 20 years of that waffle grid and that seasoned chicken and that combination landing on the table and making the first-time customer sit still for a moment in recognition. Gone on the same afternoon the warrants were executed, and boarded up before the city had fully processed the fact of its absence. You did not know, the last time you ordered the midnight train, that there would not be another time. Nobody does. 20 years ended in an afternoon, with a letter on the door and a tax debt that had been growing since long before anyone in the dining room knew it existed. Next, the Atlanta restaurant that the Wall Street Journal called the home of the best burger in America, and what a pandemic and a family without a plan did to 50 years of something irreplaceable. Section 10. Ann's Snack Bar. The rules were posted on the wall, and they were not suggestions. You read them when you came in and you followed them or you left, and leaving was not a figure of speech. Ann Price, who everyone who had ever eaten at her restaurant on Memorial Drive in Atlanta's Kirkwood neighborhood called Miss Ann, had ejected customers from her 8 stools for infractions that other restaurant owners would have absorbed without comment. Speaking too loudly at the counter, rushing her while she was cooking, putting your elbows in the wrong place, behaving in any way that suggested you had mistaken her restaurant for a place that operated on your schedule rather than hers. She ran the kitchen alone, and she ran it the way she had always run it, which was with a precision and an unhurriedness that produced a burger unlike anything else in Atlanta. And if you wanted that burger, you followed the rules of the person making it, or you found somewhere else to eat. Most people followed the rules. The building that became Ann's Snack Bar sat at 1615 Memorial Drive in Kirkwood, a neighborhood on the east side of Atlanta that was working class and black and largely overlooked by the parts of the city that were accumulating attention and investment through the 1970s and 1980s. Ann Price opened her business there in 1974, not originally as a burger place, but as a tasty dog franchise, a hot dog operation that was part of a chain of similar spots around the city. The franchise specialized in various styles of hot dogs, splits, fries, and beverages, and Ann ran it with the same focused authority she brought to everything she operated. The hot dogs were the thing for years. Then something changed. Across the street from her location on Memorial Drive, a Checkers fast food restaurant opened. Checkers was a burger chain, and its presence directly across from Anne's was a competitive fact that she approached the way she approached most things, which was by deciding she could do it better, and then doing it. She began making burgers. Her burger was not a Checkers burger. It was not any burger that had a corporate recipe behind it, or a process designed to produce the same result in 16 locations simultaneously with rotating staff. It was a burger that came from one person's specific understanding of what a burger was supposed to be, and that person was behind the counter every time you ordered it and had been thinking about the question for years before you arrived. The Ghetto Burger was a double bacon chili cheeseburger with a secret ingredient, and the name was Anne Price's own, given in the same spirit that Mike Watley had named his drive-in in Milwaukee, the spirit of self-naming, of taking the language that had been applied to the neighborhood from outside and making it yours. The burger also had lettuce, tomatoes, mustard, ketchup, and onions, and the chili that went over the top of it had been made that morning the same way it had been made every morning, slowly and with attention. There was also the Hood Burger, which replaced the lettuce and tomatoes with coleslaw, and which was its own argument for why Anne Price had been right to add burgers to the menu. The 8 stools at the counter were all there was, 8 people eating at a time, in a room that was small enough that the smell of the grill filled everything immediately and stayed. People who came from other parts of Atlanta waited outside on the patio for their stool to open up. People came from other states. The wait on a busy day could stretch past 2 hours, and the people in the wait did not leave, because leaving meant losing your place, and your place meant access to the burger, and the burger was worth the 2 hours. This was not a matter of opinion. It was a matter of documented record, which arrived in 2007 when the Wall Street Journal assigned a reporter to find the best hamburger in America, and the reporter went around the country and ate in the places that people who cared about burgers recommended, and came back and wrote the piece. And the burger at the top of the piece, the burger the Wall Street Journal called the best hamburger in America, was the Ghetto Burger at Anne's Snack Bar at 1615 Memorial Drive in Kirkwood, Atlanta, Georgia. The city noticed, the country noticed, people who had been eating the burger for years without needing the Wall Street Journal to explain it to them, noticed that the Wall Street Journal had finally caught up. The line got longer. The national food press came through. Esquire wrote about it. Anthony Bourdain, who spent his career finding the restaurants that the people who lived near them already understood to be essential, came to Kirkwood and ate the Ghetto Burger, and said what the Kirkwood neighborhood had known since Anne started making it. The James Beard Foundation, which gives its America's Classics Award to restaurants that have achieved a timeless quality in their communities, had their eye on the address. None of that changed the 8 stools. None of it changed the rules on the wall or the fact that Anne Price cooked every burger herself and moved at her own pace, and yours was not a factor in her calculation. The fame arrived and the kitchen absorbed it and kept moving. Anne Price was already in her 60s when the Wall Street Journal piece ran, had been behind the counter at 1615 Memorial Drive for over 30 years, and had been making the Ghetto Burger for long enough that the motion of making it had stopped being a decision and become a reflex. The Checkers across the street, the restaurant whose arrival had prompted her to start making burgers in the first place, was bulldozed in 2013, 13 years after it had shown up and given her the competition she had responded to by making the best burger in America. The Checkers was gone, and Anne's Snack Bar was still there. In 2010, the New York Times reported that Anne's Snack Bar was listed for sale at a price of $1.5 million. People came from all over the world, Anne told the Times, from every race, all wanting to know what a Ghetto Burger was. Nobody bought it at that price. The restaurant kept going. Anne Price died in April 2015. She was 72 years old and had been running the business at 1615 Memorial Drive for 41 years. Her death came after a period of illness involving blood clots and breast cancer, and it left the restaurant in the hands of her remaining family, her sister and 3 brothers, who kept the kitchen open and kept the rules on the wall, and kept making the Ghetto Burger the way Anne had made it, which was the only way the Ghetto Burger had ever been made at that address. The city had lost the woman. The burger was still there. In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic closed Anne's Snack Bar along with most of the restaurants in Atlanta, along with most of the restaurants in the country. The 8 stools went empty the way 8 stools go empty when there is no one permitted to sit in them. The kitchen went cold. The grill that had been running since 1974, first for hot dogs and then for the best burger in America, stopped. Anne's Snack Bar did not reopen. The family that had kept the restaurant going after Anne's death made the decision not to bring it back once the public health restrictions lifted. There was no single stated reason, no dramatic event to point to. There was a pandemic that had closed the building, and a family that had been holding something together in the years since Anne was gone, and at some point the holding together stopped. The building at 1615 Memorial Drive sat vacant. In December 2023, the property was listed for sale at $650,000, less than half what Anne had asked for it in 2010 when the restaurant was still running. A building without its reason for existing is worth less than the same building with its reason intact. The checkers that had inspired the ghetto burger was already a memory. The best burger in America was already a memory. The 8 stools sat empty in a room where the rules on the wall still told you how to behave, except that there was no one behind the counter anymore to enforce them, and no one in front of the counter anymore to need the rules, and the smell of the grill was already years gone from the walls. You waited 2 hours for that stool and you followed the rules, and the burger arrived and you understood immediately why you had waited. Nobody had to explain that to you. The burger explained it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A pandemic closed the door that 46 years of burgers had kept open. Next, the Atlanta restaurant that the city of Atlanta itself demolished with a bulldozer to build a grocery store, and what it meant to tear down a building where a civil rights leader's favorite booth had been turned into a shrine. Section 11. Alex Barbecue Heaven. The smoke reached the sidewalk before anything else did. Not the sharp, acrid smoke of a fire that is burning something it should not be burning, but the slow, sweet smoke of wood and meat that have been in a long conversation since early morning, the smoke that settles into your clothes and your hair and stays there for the rest of the day, and that you do not mind at all because the smell is one of the better smells a day can hold. On West Hunter Street in Atlanta, which runs through the part of the city that was the center of Black Atlanta during the decades of segregation, that smoke came from Alex Barbecue Heaven, and it had been coming from that building since 1942, and the people who lived and worked on that corridor had organized their sense of the block partly around it. You knew you were near Alex before you could see the sign. The smoke told you. Ernest James Alexander opened the restaurant on West Hunter Street in 1942. He was known to everyone as Alec, which was not a shortening of his name exactly but a compression of it, the kind of nickname that attaches itself to a person through the repeated practice of a community that has decided what to call him. He had worked in food before he opened his own place, had learned the specific patience that wood-smoked barbecue requires, the patience of someone who understands that the process cannot be rushed without producing something that announces the rushing. Alec's comeback sauce was his own creation, a recipe he had developed and named himself, and the name was not a coincidence or a piece of marketing language. He named it Comeback because he believed that anyone who tasted it would come back for more. The people who ate it regularly for decades believed he had been right to be that confident. The restaurant sat near the corner of West Hunter Street in what was then a dense block of Black Atlanta commerce and community. West Hunter Street Baptist Church was close by, the church where the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy led his congregation, which made West Hunter Street a corridor that carried the weight of the civil rights movement in a specific and geographic way. Abernathy was one of King's closest friends and advisors, the man who had built the Southern Christian Leadership Conference alongside him and who would deliver the eulogy at King's funeral in 1968. His church and Alec's restaurant and Pascal's Motor Hotel across the street existed within walking distance of each other on the same block, which meant that the people who were architecting the civil rights movement in Atlanta were regularly within a few hundred feet of smoked meat and comeback sauce. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Alex regularly. His daughter, Pamela Alexander, who is the daughter of Ernest Alexander and not of King, has described in interviews how her father kept the restaurant available to movement leaders whenever they needed it, how King and the others would finish their strategy sessions at Pascal's and walk across the street to Alex for the late-night part of the evening, the part that required food rather than planning. King had a particular table he preferred at Alex, a booth where he sat when he came in, and the restaurant learned the booth and gave it to him the way rooms learn certain people's preferences through the practice of accommodating them repeatedly. You did not take that booth when King was expected. That was understood. The barbecue at Alex operated on the logic of wood and time, which is the only logic that produces the result the restaurant was known for. The smoke penetrated the meat over hours, changing the structure of the outside layer into what barbecue people call the bark, a crust that has been transformed by smoke and heat into something that concentrates the flavor of the meat beneath it. Inside the bark, the meat had gone through whatever the long heat does to protein, the collagen converting to gelatin, the fat rendering slowly through the tissue, the whole thing becoming tender in a way that has nothing in common with the tenderness of something that has been cooked quickly. You pulled a rib from the rack and the meat separated from the bone with the particular resistance that means it was done exactly right and not a minute past exactly right. The comeback sauce went on at the table, or it went on in the kitchen depending on what you asked for, and it had the quality of something that had been built to complement what was already there, rather than to cover it. Ernest Alexander ran Alex Barbecue Heaven, and also owned 5 other barbecue restaurants across the city of Atlanta at various points, which meant that the operation he had built was not simply a single address on West Hunter Street, but a small enterprise, a black-owned business network in a city that in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s offered black entrepreneurs a specific and narrow set of corridors in which to operate. He built inside those corridors. He built something that the city recognized, that the civil rights movement used as a resource, and that his family understood as the center of what he had made of his life in Atlanta. When King was assassinated in Memphis on April 4, 1968, the grief that moved through Black Atlanta was the grief of a community that had lost something irreplaceable, something that had been the organizing principle of a decade of struggle, and that was now suddenly gone. Alex Barbecue Heaven responded to that loss the way the restaurant had always responded to King's presence, which was by making the response about the booth. The booth where King had sat became a memorial. The restaurant marked it, honored it, kept it as the fixed point in the dining room that acknowledged what the man who had sat there had meant to the block and to the city and to the country. You did not sit in that booth after 1968. You ate your barbecue at a different table, and you looked at the booth, and you understood what the room was doing by holding it that way. The restaurant ran through the following decades. West Hunter Street was renamed Martin Luther King Jr. Drive in honor of the man who had eaten at the booth in the back, which was the kind of renaming that a city does to acknowledge a history it has decided to claim. The smoke kept coming off the building and reaching the sidewalk every morning. The comeback sauce kept going on the ribs. The neighborhood around the restaurant changed as Atlanta changed, the commercial character of the street shifting, and the demographics around it shifting, and the pressures of urban development beginning to land on the west side of the city in ways that were not always visible until the decisions had already been made. In the late 1990s, the city of Atlanta exercised eminent domain on the property where Alex Barbecue Heaven stood. Eminent domain is the legal mechanism by which a government acquires private property for public use, compensating the owner at a determined value and proceeding with whatever the government has decided the land is needed for. The city determined that the land on West Hunter Street, including the building where the smoke had been reaching the sidewalk since 1942, was needed for a public supermarket, a grocery chain. The building that had held King's Booth and Alex Comeback Sauce and 55 years of wood smoke was demolished to make way for a Publix. The Publix was itself later replaced by a Walmart supercenter, which is the current occupant of the site. No marker stands at the corner. No plaque on the exterior of the Walmart tells the person pushing a cart through the parking lot that a restaurant once stood there where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. ate barbecue and where a booth had been preserved as a memorial to him after his death. The history is not on the building. It is not on the ground. It is in the memory of the people who ate there, and in the descriptions of those people, and in the photographs that survive, and in the comeback sauce that Pamela Alexander, Ernest Alexander's daughter, has kept alive as a product in the years since the restaurant was taken down. The city demolished a civil rights landmark and built a grocery store and later a Walmart, and the transaction was legal, and the compensation was paid, and the smoke that had been reaching the sidewalk every morning since 1942 stopped reaching the sidewalk. The booth had no marker. The building had no marker. The parking lot of the Walmart has no marker. You can push your cart across the site of the thing and never know what was there. Nobody will tell you unless you already know to ask. The city took Alex with a bulldozer and a legal instrument and put a parking lot where the booth had been. Next, a restaurant 2 blocks away on the same street that the city of Atlanta also erased, except this one it erased quietly, to build something for the 1996 Summer Olympics, and the woman who ran the kitchen described what was happening to her in a newspaper while it was still happening. Section 12. Thelma's Kitchen mac and cheese counted as a vegetable at Thelma's Kitchen, and that was not an accident or a quirk or a piece of humor that had ended up on the menu board by mistake. It was a statement about what kind of restaurant Thelma Grundy ran on South Broad Street in downtown Atlanta, which was the kind of restaurant where the person building the menu understood that a properly made macaroni and cheese occupied a different category than anything that came out of a box, that it had been constructed with care and baked long enough to develop a blistered top crust and a center closer to custard than to anything you would call a side dish, and that it belonged on the plate alongside the collard greens and the black-eyed peas and the rutabaga and the fried chicken as something that deserved to be counted and chosen and eaten with full attention. You picked your 2 sides or your 3 sides depending on how the week had gone and how hungry you arrived, and the mac and cheese was always one of the things you considered, always one of the things that earned its place on the tray no matter what else was going on the plate. Thelma Grundy ran a meat and three, which is the southern restaurant format that asks you to choose one protein and two or three vegetables from whatever the kitchen has prepared that day, and that produces a different meal for every person at the table depending on what they have chosen and how the combinations have landed. At Thelma's, the proteins were the fried chicken and the chicken fried steak, both built through decades of repetition until the preparation had stopped being a process requiring thought and become something the hands performed independently of any deliberate decision. The sides were a rotating assembly. The collard greens that had been going since early morning, the black-eyed peas that had been given all the time they needed, the rutabaga, the sweet potato soufflé, the cornbread, the peach cobbler, and on certain days the okra pancakes, which arrived on the menu infrequently enough that the regular customers who happened to be present on those days felt they had received something beyond the meal they had come in to order. Meatloaf appeared on Thursdays, and the regulars who knew the schedule planned around it, which is the kind of relationship a kitchen and its neighborhood build across years and cannot manufacture quickly. Sweet potato soufflé was what people returned to most often in their descriptions of Thelma's kitchen, because it was the dish that produced the particular reaction certain preparations produce, which is a moment of stillness at the table after the first bite, a beat in which the person eating has to absorb what is in the mouth before the conversation can resume. The soufflé was silky in the way of something whipped and baked until the air incorporated into it had expanded and held, and the sweetness in it was calibrated against the rest of the plate in a way that made you reach back to it between bites of everything else, using it as the thing that reset the palate and made the next forkful of chicken fried steak more interesting than it would have been encountered alone. In 1994, Rick Bragg, then a Southern writer for the New York Times, came to Thelma's kitchen on South Broad Street and wrote about the food with the precision and weight it deserved. He wrote about the way gravy moved through rice as something that announced the meal before the first bite was taken. He wrote that the black-eyed peas had been given everything that time and attention could give them, which is the only condition under which black-eyed peas are fully worth eating. He wrote that the fried chicken was at a level of quality that seemed improbable for something made in an ordinary kitchen by human hands. He filed all of it with the newspaper while he already knew the place was weeks from gone. Atlanta had made its decision. The city determined that the block on South Broad Street where Thelma's kitchen stood was needed for Centennial Olympic Park. The 1996 Summer Olympics were coming to Atlanta, and the preparation for them required clearing a significant portion of downtown real estate to build the public gathering space at the center of the games. The block included in that clearing was the block where Thelma Grundy had been cooking for the downtown workforce of police officers and office workers and politicians and church families who came in when the week had been long enough that driving somewhere felt like too much and they needed somewhere close and real instead. Thelma Grundy told Bragg what she thought of the demolition while the kitchen was still running. She said they were calling it progress, but it was not progress to her. She said they were simply pushing her out, and she was sorry about it, and she did not know what she would do when the building came down. She said she supposed she would just cry. She said all of this while the soufflé was still coming out of the oven, and the fried chicken was still at the level that had made the New York Times send someone south to write about it, because the wrecking crew had not yet arrived and she was still behind the counter, and the loss was approaching from a fixed date on a calendar she had not made and could not change. That is simply how it works when a city decides a block is needed for something else. Atlanta built the park. The 1996 Summer Olympics arrived that July, and Centennial Olympic Park was the gathering space the city had designed it to be. On the block on South Broad Street, under the footprint of what the games required, the kitchen where the okra pancakes had appeared on the days Thelma felt like making them was already gone. The gravy that moved through the rice was gone with it. Thelma Grundy did not stop. She relocated the restaurant to 302 Auburn Avenue in the Sweet Auburn neighborhood, moving into the building that had housed the Auburn Avenue Rib Shack before that restaurant closed in 1994, a building that had been a restaurant in one form or another since the 1940s. Thelma's Kitchen opened on Auburn Avenue and kept operating. The downtown regulars found the new address. Ted Turner, who was among the most prominent businessmen in Atlanta at that point, ate at the Auburn Avenue location. Evander Holyfield came in regularly during the years when his name was one of the most recognizable in professional boxing. The dining room on Auburn Avenue held the range of people the downtown location had held because the food was the same food, and the woman making it was the same woman, and the reason to find her and eat what she produced did not disappear because the street had changed. Something changed that was harder to see from inside the dining room. A restaurant that has operated continuously for decades inside a fixed location has a momentum that the place and the time have built together, and that momentum does not simply transfer to a new address when the kitchen moves, even when the cook and the preparations are identical. Regulars who had organized part of their week around the fact that Thelma's was on their block had to make a conscious new decision to seek the restaurant at its new location rather than simply going to where it had always been. Some made that decision every week. Some made it occasionally. Some found somewhere else and did not come back. Rebuilding a restaurant's relationship with its neighborhood from a new address is harder than the original building, because the original had the advantage of establishing itself before anyone knew to take it for granted. Auburn Avenue held Thelma's Kitchen for nearly 2 more decades. Then in 2014 it closed. Thelma Grundy died in April 2020, 6 years after the restaurant had gone quiet, which meant she had outlived it, and spent those years away from the kitchen that had organized her working life through the decades, from South Broad Street to Auburn Avenue, and then into silence. Asa Fain, a local restaurateur, purchased the building at 302 Auburn Avenue in 2018 and undertook a restoration that expanded the interior to 4,000 square feet. In April 2024, he opened a new restaurant called Auburn Angel in the building, serving what the kitchen described as global cuisine, dishes rooted in flavors from around the world. Near the entrance, given a deliberate place of prominence, was the original grill pit from the Auburn Avenue Rib Shack, the restaurant that had occupied the building before Thelma's, scorched and patinaed from decades of fire, preserved as a marker of what the ground had held before the current room was built on top of it. No sweet potato souffle was coming out of that kitchen, no okra pancakes on the days the mood struck. A different chef was making different food for a different room, and the building was full again, and the reviews were warm, and the old pit near the entrance held the memory of 2 restaurants it had outlasted. You picked the souffle as one of your 3 sides, and you went still for a moment after the first bite, the way you always did, and then you reached for it again between bites of everything else because that was what the dish required of you, and you did not think about Olympic parks or eminent domain or what a city does when it decides a block is needed for something other than the thing currently standing on it. Nobody asked you to think about any of that while the souffle was still warm. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 Atlanta restaurants taken by the same city in the same decade, neither one left with a marker on the ground. Next, a restaurant that spent 32 years in the shadow of the White House, feeding the capital of a nation that never officially acknowledged what it was doing to places exactly like it. Section 13. Georgia Brown's, the gumbo arrived in a bowl that was deep enough to require a long spoon, and the color of it was the particular dark brown that means a roux has been cooked past the point where most kitchens stop, taken all the way to the edge of what a roux can be before it tips over into bitterness, which is a line that requires either a timer or enough experience that the eyes and the nose have become the timer. At Georgia Brown's on 15th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., the roux had been taken all the way to that line every time, which meant the gumbo had a depth underneath the shrimp and the okra and the andouille that you did not get from a kitchen operating with less patience or less nerve. You took the first spoonful and it was hot and complex, and the flavors arrived in sequence rather than all at once, the heat coming first and then the richness of the roux, and then the sweetness of the shellfish, and then something long and smoky from the andouille that finished the spoonful and sent you immediately toward the second one. On a Sunday morning with live jazz moving through the dining room from the corner where the musicians set up, with the bronze ceiling scroll above you catching the light the way the restaurant's designers had intended when they chose it as a reference to the great oak trees that line southern streets, the gumbo was not merely food. It was a piece of an argument that Washington, D.C. was making about what kind of city it had become. Georgia Brown's opened in 1993 at 950 15th Street Northwest, 1 block from the White House, in a location that placed it inside the daily geography of the most powerful city in the country. The address meant that the people who walked through the door on any given weekday were people who worked in the orbit of federal power, staffers and officials and journalists, and the various categories of person that a capital city generates in abundance when it is functioning at full capacity. But the restaurant was not built for that clientele, the way certain Washington restaurants are built for specific clienteles, designed around the preferences and the self-image of a particular kind of diner. Georgia Brown's was built around low country cuisine, the cooking tradition of the South Carolina and Georgia coast, which is the cooking tradition that emerged from the Gullah Geechee communities that had built those coastlines and farmed them and fed themselves from them for centuries. It was black food, rooted in black history, served at a restaurant with a bronze ceiling scroll and a Sunday jazz brunch, and a menu built on gumbo and grits and shrimp and red rice and Hoppin' John, 2 blocks from the building where the President of the United States lived. For 32 years, Georgia Brown's existed as what the Philadelphia Tribune described as a vibrant culinary symbol of the era when Washington was the nation's first large majority black city. That description contains a number of things worth sitting with. Washington had been a majority black city for decades, shaped by the Great Migration and by the federal employment that had drawn black families to the capital, and by the particular culture that a majority black city produces when it has enough density and enough time. The restaurants that come out of that kind of city are not approximations of somewhere else. They are expressions of the place itself, of what the people who built the place decided to feed each other when they had the space to decide. The Sunday jazz brunch at Georgia Brown's was the version of the restaurant that most of the city knew best, or at least the version that produced the longest memories in the people who attended it regularly. The musicians sat up in the corner and played through the brunch hours, not at the volume of a performance that asks you to stop what you are doing and listen, but at the volume of music that moves through a room as a condition of the room rather than an interruption of it. You could feel it in the floor when the bass moved through a lower register, and you could feel it in the back of your chest when the trumpet opened up toward the end of a phrase, and the gumbo was in front of you and the grits were right. The grits done the way low country grits are supposed to be done, which is slowly and with enough fat to give them the consistency of something substantial, rather than the watery looseness that bad grits produce. The buffet table on Sunday mornings held ham and shrimp and grits and bacon and French fries and the kind of cornbread that announced itself by smell before the server reached your table, and the dining room filled up early and stayed full through the late morning and into the early afternoon because nobody was in a particular hurry to leave a room that was doing what Georgia Brown's did on a Sunday. The Michelin Guide included Georgia Brown's in its Washington, D.C. selections in 2022, which is the kind of recognition that a restaurant receives when it has been doing something with consistent excellence for long enough that the institutional machinery of culinary evaluation has caught up to what the neighborhood already knew. The restaurant had been excellent for nearly 30 years at that point. The Michelin recognition arrived when Georgia Brown's had already built the complete record of what it was, when the bronze ceiling scroll had been catching the light for 3 decades, and the gumbo roux had been taken to the edge of its capacity every service day for nearly as long. Washington's soul food landscape had been thinning for years before Georgia Brown's closed. Horace and Dickey's, which was renowned across the city specifically for its fried fish, closed its Washington location in early 2020. District Soul Food, which had operated on Capitol Hill, closed in 2021. Tory's, which had occupied the edge of the Howard University campus and fed students and neighborhood residents for 30 years, shuttered the year before Georgia Brown's posted its closing notice. Each of these closures removed something from a landscape that had fewer and fewer places left in it, and each of them reflected the same underlying pressure, which was the economics of operating a soul food restaurant in a city where rents were climbing, where the majority black character that had defined Washington for decades was giving way to the demographic shifts that sustained investment and rising property values produce, and where the customer base that had once filled these dining rooms on a Wednesday afternoon had scattered to surrounding counties or left the city entirely. Georgia Brown's announced in July 2025 that its space had been made available for lease, which is the language a restaurant uses when it is telling the city that the restaurant is ending, without quite saying that the restaurant is ending. The social media accounts went quiet, the reservation system closed. On September 1, 2025, 32 years after it had opened 1 block from the White House with a menu built on the food of the South Carolina coast and a Sunday jazz brunch that people organized their weekends around, Georgia Brown's served its last meal. No announcement about what would occupy the space followed immediately. The bronze ceiling scroll, the honeybee logo that had referenced the Georgia state insect since the restaurant's designers chose it in 1993 as a symbol of something small and essential and often unacknowledged. The corner where the musicians set up on Sunday mornings. All of it passed from operating restaurant to available square footage in a block of downtown Washington that had plenty of takers for available square footage and no particular mechanism for preserving what had stood there. 32 years of gumbo taken to the edge of the roux. 32 years of grits prepared with the patience they require. 32 years of jazz on Sunday mornings in a room built to hold both the music and the meal at once. In the shadow of the building where the country conducts its official business. In a city that was slowly becoming a different city than the one that had needed Georgia Brown's in the first place. You sat at that Sunday brunch table with the gumbo in front of you and the music in the floor beneath your feet and the bronze ceiling above you catching the light, and you did not calculate the demographics of a shifting city or track the closing of the restaurants that had come before it. The gumbo was hot. The roux was right. The musicians were in the corner. That was enough. 32 years in the shadow of the White House, and still not enough to hold the ground. Next, the story of a family that brought southern catfish from Texas to Seattle in 1985 and spent 40 years feeding a neighborhood, right up until the neighborhood itself stopped being what it had been. Section 14, Jackson's Catfish Corner. The catfish came out of the fryer in strips that had been dredged in seasoned cornmeal, and the cornmeal had crisped into a crust that held its texture past the point where lesser frying lets it go, the heat having been exactly right, and the oil having been exactly right, and the timing having been managed by people who had made this particular decision thousands of times, and knew what the crust looked like when it was done, and what it looked like when it needed 30 more seconds. You broke into a strip and the interior was white and flaking and moist, the kind of catfish that does not taste muddy or heavy, but clean and slightly sweet, the flavor of the fish itself coming through underneath the cornmeal, rather than being buried by it. In Seattle's Central District, on a street that had been the center of Black Seattle since the Great Migration began delivering families from Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi to the Pacific Northwest, that catfish was the specific thing that Woodrow and Rosemary Jackson had decided the neighborhood needed and did not have, and they had been right, and the neighborhood had told them they were right by lining up for it for decades. The story of Jackson's Catfish Corner begins not in Seattle but in the South, which is where the story of most of the Central District begins. Woodrow Jackson, known to his family and his regulars as Woody, had grown up eating catfish prepared the way his family prepared it in Texas, which was the way catfish had been prepared in black Southern kitchens for generations, fried in cornmeal with a seasoning that went into the coating before the fish went into the oil. His wife Rosemary, known as Rosie, had grown up in Louisiana, which brought its own tradition of seafood preparation to the marriage, a tradition that understood that what you do to a piece of fish before it hits the pan is at least as important as what you do to it while it is in the pan. Together they had the full vocabulary of Southern seafood cooking between them, and when they arrived in Seattle as part of the movement of black families from the South to the West Coast that had been going on since the Second World War, they brought that vocabulary with them. Woody worked at Bethlehem Steel after they arrived in Seattle, the kind of industrial employment that the Pacific Northwest offered to black workers in those decades. Steady and physically demanding, and not particularly connected to what he had grown up knowing how to do. What he knew how to do was cook catfish. Seattle in the early 1980s did not have a place that cooked catfish the way he knew how to cook it, which was the way the South had been cooking it, which was the way his family had been cooking it, which was the only way that produced the result that could properly be called catfish, rather than merely fish that happened to be catfish. He started frying catfish in his backyard and giving it to neighbors, which is how you learn whether what you have is good enough to ask people to pay for it, and the neighbors told him it was. In January 1985, Woodrow and Rosemary Jackson opened Catfish Corner at the corner of Martin Luther King Jr. Way and East Cherry Street in the Central District. The corner was not chosen arbitrarily. Martin Luther King Jr. Way was one of the central corridors of Black Seattle, a street that had accumulated black-owned businesses and black community institutions across the decades of the Great Migration, as the Central District built the infrastructure a community needs to sustain itself. A catfish restaurant at that corner was not only a food establishment, it was a statement that the neighborhood could build and maintain the things it needed, including the specific flavor of its own origins, in a city that had no particular mechanism for providing it. The menu that Rosie and Woody built around the catfish expanded outward from that center. Gumbo, made the way Rosie had learned to make it in Louisiana, with the patience the roux required and the shellfish and the okra and the andouille that the tradition called for. Hush puppies, fried golden and slightly sweet, the kind that arrive at the table hot enough to steam when you break them open. Prawns, snapper, collard greens and candied sweet potatoes, and rice and beans and coleslaw. The captain's platter, which was the ordering decision that settled the question of what you were getting for the rest of the meal, included 7 strips of catfish and 7 prawns, which is the kind of quantity that tells you the kitchen understands what hunger is and does not intend to send you away in a condition short of satisfied. The gumbo was served in a bowl that meant business. For 25 years, Woody and Rosie built the restaurant into what the Central District understood as a fixed point in the neighborhood's geography. You knew where Catfish Corner was the way you knew where the church was and where the barber shop was, not because anyone had given you directions recently, but because the address had accumulated through years of going there and years of hearing other people mention going there, until the location had become part of your internal map of the neighborhood. Mayors came in, Seahawks players came in. The walls of the restaurant filled with the photographs and the signatures of people who had come through and wanted to leave something of themselves in a room that had clearly meant something to the people around them. In 2009, Woody and Rosie Jackson retired and sold the business to friends, which was the decision of people who had built something through decades of physical labor and had earned the right to stop. The friends who bought it kept it running until 2014, when it closed. The legacy of what Woody and Rosie had built at Martin Luther King Jr. Way and Cherry Street was sitting in the memory of the neighborhood and in the specific knowledge of one family member who had grown up eating the food and understood what it meant. Terrell Jackson was Woody and Rosie's grandson, and in 2015 he made the decision that put him behind the fryer his grandparents had built their lives around. He did not start with a building. He started with a tent and a deep fryer on a sidewalk in the Skyway neighborhood, selling catfish from a pop-up operation the way his grandfather had sold it from his backyard before the restaurant existed, testing the proposition that what he had learned from his family was good enough to ask people to drive across Seattle for. The proposition held. He worked through a series of temporary and permanent locations in Rainier Valley and in the Central District and at New Hope Church, and eventually back to the Central District, where the family's restaurant had started. In June 2021, Juneteenth of that year, he opened Jackson's Catfish Corner at 2218 South Jackson Street, bringing the name and the catfish and the gumbo and the hush puppies back to the neighborhood his grandparents had fed for a quarter century. The Central District that Terrell returned to was not the Central District his grandparents had opened inside in 1985. The neighborhood that had been roughly 75% black in 1970 was closer to 15% black by the early 2020s. The demographic shift was the result of decades of rising property values and the displacement that rising property values produce when the people who built a neighborhood cannot afford the rents that their presence has made the neighborhood attractive enough to command. The customer base that had sustained the original Catfish Corner was geographically dispersed in ways that made the relationship between the restaurant and its neighborhood more complicated than it had been when Woody and Rosie opened at the corner of MLK and Cherry. Terrell ran Jackson's Catfish Corner at 23rd and South Jackson for 3.5 years. On January 3, 2025, 2 days after Seattle's minimum wage increased to $20.67 per hour, he announced on Instagram that the restaurant was closing. The announcement came in the morning, and by the time the restaurant opened that day, the line was out the door. People who had been coming since Woody and Rosie's time came. People who had found the restaurant through Terrell's revival came. First-timers who had heard about it came and stood in a line they had no history with, because the line itself had become the news, and the news had told them they were almost out of time. The kitchen fried its final 50 pounds of catfish that day, which is a very specific number, the number that a kitchen manages when it knows the day is ending, and measures out what it needs to serve the people still waiting, rather than ordering in the quantities a restaurant orders when it expects to open again tomorrow. The last strip of catfish came out of the oil with the crust holding exactly the way the crust had been holding since Woody started in his backyard in the early 1980s, seasoned through and golden and crisp past the point where lesser frying lets it go. Terrell spoke to the room and to the camera. 40 years, he said. 40 years of business in Seattle. And he appreciated every person who had stepped through those doors, from mayors to Seahawk players to regular people. Everyone who had supported a small black business across 4 decades in a city that had given him his flowers, he said. On the closing day, the fryer went cold. The line outside the door dispersed. The corner of 23rd and South Jackson became a corner again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 40 years of catfish in a neighborhood that slowly stopped being the neighborhood it was built for. Next, the final restaurant on this list. A small Georgia institution that managed to give its name to one of the most famous rock albums ever recorded, and that spent 40 years feeding a college town before closing quietly in February of this year. Section 15, Weaver D's Delicious Fine Foods. The lime green building on East Broad Street in Athens, Georgia, did not look like a place that had named one of the most celebrated rock albums of the 1990s. It looked like what it was, which was a small soul food counter with 40 seats and a chalkboard menu and a kitchen run by one man who had been cooking since he was 5 years old, when his great-grandmother stood him next to her and showed him what to do with peas. The building was lime green because Dexter Weaver had painted it lime green, and it stayed lime green for 40 years because Dexter Weaver was still the one deciding what color the building was, the same way he was still the one deciding what went on the chalkboard, and what time the doors opened, and how long the fried chicken stayed in the fryer. 15 minutes at 350 degrees, seasoned with salt and pepper and garlic before it went in, every time, the same way his family had done it, the same way he had done it, since he opened the doors in May of 1986, and had not seen any reason to change since. Dexter Weaver grew up in Athens and left for a time before coming back around 1979. He had learned to cook the way people learn to cook when the knowledge is in the family rather than in a curriculum, which is through proximity and repetition, and the slow accumulation of understanding that comes from doing something alongside someone who already knows how to do it correctly. When he opened Weaver D's Delicious Fine Foods at 1016 East Broad Street, the menu was the food he had grown up eating and had grown up cooking, the fried chicken and the pork chops and the fried catfish and the squash casserole, and the side dishes that in a meat and three format ask the customer to make a series of small decisions that together produce something closer to a home-cooked meal than anything a restaurant with a fixed plate can offer. University of Georgia students came in alongside the people who had lived on that side of Athens their whole lives, and both groups got the same chalkboard and the same counter and the same food coming out of the same kitchen. What Dexter Weaver said to customers when their order was ready was not "thank you." It was automatic for the people, which he used instead of "thank you," because it expressed something closer to what he felt about the transaction, which was not gratitude exactly, but a kind of affirmation, a declaration that what he was doing was for the people in front of him, and that it happened automatically, without hesitation, as a natural condition of what the restaurant was. The phrase was his. He had been saying it for years before anyone outside the neighborhood of East Broad Street had reason to know what it meant. In the fall of 1992, REM released their 8th studio album. The band had formed in Athens in 1980 and had played their first concert there, and had spent the early years of their career building something in a college town that turned out to be large enough to hold what they were making. By 1992, they were one of the most significant bands in the world, and the album they were preparing to release was the album that would become their best-selling record, a collection of songs that moved differently from anything they had made before, slower, and more interior, and more willing to sit with grief. Michael Stipe, the band's lead singer, went to Dexter Weaver and asked permission to use his catchphrase as the album title. Dexter said yes. The album sold 21 million copies worldwide. The title on the cover of every one of those copies was a phrase that had originated behind a counter on East Broad Street in Athens, Georgia, where a man in a lime green building was handing plates to students and locals and saying what he always said when the order was ready. Dexter Weaver released an autobiography and recipe book in 1999 titled Automatic Y'all, which put his name and his food and his philosophy into a form that could leave the building and travel. People came to the restaurant because of the album connection, came to stand inside the room where the phrase had originated, came to order the fried chicken and the squash casserole, and hear Dexter say the phrase when the plate slid across the counter. The restaurant had become a landmark in the way that places become landmarks when something larger than the place itself has attached its name to the address, and the foot traffic that landmark status produces kept the dining room full across the decades that followed. The restaurant ran into financial difficulty at some point in those years, the kind of difficulty that small independent restaurants encounter when the margins are thin and the costs do not stop. What happened next was not the city exercising eminent domain, and not a tax raid, and not a health inspection that found violations the kitchen could not correct. What happened was that the people who had been eating at Weaver D's decided they were not finished eating there. Customers organized, money came in, the crisis passed. A small soul food counter on East Broad Street had generated enough loyalty in the people it had fed that those people were willing to act on the loyalty when the counter needed them to. The restaurant stayed open. Dexter Weaver put the restaurant up for sale in October 2025. He was approaching 71 years old, had been behind the counter since 1986, and had arrived at the place that anyone arrives at after 40 years of doing the same physical work with the same consistency. He wanted to stop. He listed the building and the business and waited for someone who could carry it forward. No buyer came. The building sold in February 2026 to Joe Nedza, a local restaurant operator, who said he intended to open a new concept in the space. Dexter announced the final days of service: Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, February 24th, 25, and 26, 2026. The line on the last day started forming at 10:15 in the morning. It went past the awning at the front of the lime green building and wrapped around the driveway and into the rain, because it was raining in Athens that Thursday, and nobody in the line was leaving because of it. People who had eaten there as children brought their own children. Students who had been eating at the counter since their first week at UGA came back one final time. A man named Yonatan, interviewed outside in the line, said the last time he had been inside was when he was 8 or 9 years old, when his father was a UGA student and had taken him there, and he had been thinking about the pound cake ever since. Dexter Weaver served his last plate on February 26, 2026, 40 years after he had served his first one. The lime green building passed to its new owner. A chicken tender restaurant now operates at 1016 East Broad Street. The chalkboard is gone. The phrase is still on 21 million album covers. Nobody who stood in that rain on the last day will forget what they were standing in it for. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.